Cancórla. On this, the last day that the Taoiseach will be answering leaders' questions here before September at the earliest, he has now told us that the government has three economic objectives: to improve competitiveness, to sort out the banks, and to restore order to the public finances. Now, before we rise on Friday, before the Dáil breaks for the summer, I want to know what that means. And I think the public of the country are entitled to know what each of those three means. On improving competitiveness, I have seen no evidence from government of anything that they've done to improve competitiveness. In fact, all I've seen is the reverse. Increasing VAT, for example, which has worsened competitiveness for Irish business. In relation to dealing with the banks, 3 months ago, the government told us that their strategy for restoring the banking situation was to establish NAMA. 3 months later, we don't have the legislation which will do that. We don't have a precise date as to when that legislation will be introduced. And when Deputy Burton asked the Taoiseach about a timetable for the NAMA process, the Taoiseach was at best vague about it yesterday. So before the Dáil is put into recess for the summer by the government, I think we need to know and we need to see where is the NAMA legislation, and to have it published, and if necessary to have it addressed here in the House. Thirdly, in relation to putting order on the public finances, again we are told that the way in which that's going to be done is by way of the recommendations in the McCarthy report. We haven't seen the McCarthy report. All we've been told is that the McCarthy was supposed to report before the end of June. That didn't happen. With each passing week, as we came closer to the recess, the McCarthy report has drifted out further and further until now. It is perfectly clear that what the government's intention with the McCarthy report is to receive it after the Dáil has gone into recess, or certainly after we've had an opportunity to question the Taoiseach and ministers about it here, and then to selectively leak its contents in a kind of a softening up exercise during the course of the summer. So again, before we break for the summer, I want to see the McCarthy report. So Taoiseach, I want to ask you this. Will we have the NAMA legislation published before the House rises for the summer? Will the McCarthy report be published before the House rises for the summer? And if you can't give an assurance that that will be done before Friday, will you at least assure us that the House will continue in session until both of those essential pieces of information are put into the public domain, and we know where we stand in relation to your strategy on the economy before the Dáil goes into recess for the summer? I remind the Taoiseach that we had an exchange somewhat similar to this exactly this time last year. This time last year, I, on behalf of the Labour Party, asked the Taoiseach not to put the Dáil into recess because of the deteriorating economic situation. That was in July of last year. And I have a motion here that we proposed at the time, in which we drew attention to the fact that the live register figures had then gone through the 200,000 barrier, and that the economic situation was deteriorating. The Taoiseach at that time seemed to adopt the attitude that the economic business of the country was the private business of the government, and that they would do what they had to do. They arrived back here in September in a panic and have stumbled from one crisis to another ever since. And it would appear that the government has learned nothing. The Taoiseach is still behaving as though the business of the people, the economic business of the country, the difficulties that people are having with jobs now, the number of unemployed is twice what it was last year. The difficulties that people have with job losses, with business losses. We had a report yesterday from the City and County Enterprise Development Boards showing that a half of the businesses that they survey and that they're in touch with are finding it more difficult now, to get credit from financial institutions than they did 6 months ago. The Taoiseach comes in here and says he doesn't want to defer decisions. You're doing nothing but deferring. Because before this House goes into recess, and this isn't your business, this isn't a matter for private discussion by government, this is public business. The state of the economy is public business, and you are withholding from the public. You're withholding from the public. It's not about withholding, it's not about courtesy to the House. That may come into it as well, but that's not primarily what it's about. My principal objection for you withholding the McCarthy report, and withholding it you are, This nonsense about it hasn't been delivered yet, and we'll get it later in the week, and then we'll discuss it, is all nonsense. You know what's in the McCarthy report. You have the McCarthy report. You are simply delaying receiving it so that you won't have to publish it, so that you won't have to answer for it here in the course of debate. We need to see that. If that's going to be the basis, Taoiseach, of how you're going to deal with public expenditure and how you're going to deal with the delivery of public services for the rest of this year into 2010, then we need to see what is in it, and you should put it up on the table before the House breaks for the summer. Secondly, because of the uncertainty that exists in banking, and there is uncertainty in banking, we're now 3 months since you announced the NAMA strategy for dealing with the banking situation. You're addressing the legislation as though it was some obscure piece of amending some old statute that you just hadn't got round to do, or the draftsman hadn't got round to do, or the minister hadn't got round to preparing the heads of it. This was supposed to be the urgent piece of legislation. This is what the Minister for Finance told us on the day of the supplementary budget, that this was urgent and it was going to be presented. 3 months later, and on the eve of the Dáil going into recess for the summer, we don't have the legislation, we don't have an exact date as to when it's going to be introduced. You can't tell us a timetable for the NAMA process itself, and meanwhile there's continuing uncertainty in banking. Your dithering, your delay and your incompetence is creating even further difficulties for the economy of this country, which is being paid for week in, week out by people who are losing their jobs and businesses which are going to the wall.